First, I wish to thank James Boston and the Association of Former British Colonies for sponsoring today's live discussion on the issue of reparations and for inviting me to contribute a case against Britain owing reparations. As a citizen of former British colonies whose colonial governments united to rebel against the crown and an elitist parliament in 1776 to become the United States of America, parts of my ancestry can be traced to Robert Jones, a Welsh Quaker of Worcester, who left for the North American colonies only months after Cromwell's troops killed 3,000 of the Crown's Scottish troops, and to Havana Cottrell, my great-great-great-grandmother from Yoruba, Africa, amongst many others. During the past decade, we have seen a real explosion in the effects of structural racism against people of African and other non-European descent. So I welcome this opportunity to debate the wisdom of reparations, especially for British citizens and Commonwealth persons of African descent who continue to suffer from legacies of slavery, and whether, quote, Britain, unquote, has an obligation, legal or otherwise, to facilitate reparations. One way of discussing this issue is from a common law, tort law damages perspective. Although people from either side of the European constructed enterprise of chattel slavery are now deceased, there is something in English legal models that addresses the damages suffered by victims. Originally under common law, a person's claim against another for damages died with that person. But eventually, the voting 3% in England decided this was a legal loophole that was in need of plugging. For example, a murdered victim is unable to bring a tort action against her or his murderer for damages, for the simple reason that the victim is dead. The voting 3% in England recognized this deficiency in the common law during the 1840s, and they addressed it by statute, which empowered beneficiaries to make claims for damages on behalf of a person who suffered damages but is deceased. Later, added to this was the idea of restitution for unjust enrichment. Now, we also must discern who are the people that actually did the slavery. When we ask, does Britain owe reparations, we must define the term Britain. The vast majority of the Celts and English peoples of the British Isles had no role in that. 97% could not even vote on the laws that made it possible. Yet the vast majority of the English public, they had no say in any lawmaking until 1867, 60 years after the Parliament of the voting 3% passed an act of the abolition of the slave trade, and 2 years after African Americans won suffrage in the USA. If we define Britain as the British Empire, which did not abolish slavery in its colonies until 1833, this is still 34 years before the majority of white British could vote on the laws they and everyone else suffered under. How do we define Britain and British Empire? Are they simply the Crown and Parliament? Where then will the Crown or Parliament get the monetary funds today that would become reparations? Apart from revenues that they collect from the working majority of the population, the British government has no independent source of wealth. Contemporary descendants of the non-voting 97% prior to suffrage in 1867, who suffered the laws and class discriminations promulgated by the voting 3% until 1867, would bear the true burden of reparations today. For the descendants of the disenfranchised English and Celts during chattel slavery to bear the financial burden of reparations seems unjust. They could not vote until 1867 for non-farm laboring males and 1919 for women and farm laboring males. Asking them to fund reparations will stir resentment in people who perceive themselves to have had nothing to do with slavery or writing the laws that promoted it. The voting 3% created a class-divided society where white Celts were relegated to the bottom as, quote, white apes, unquote. As wage slaves without a vote, the disenfranchised majority seldom received a day's pay for a day's work or safety equipment to work safely. Jail fees for incarceration as penalty for petty offenses promulgated by the voting 3% was billed weekly, with accrued incarceration for non-payment. The only escape for many was to sign up for indentured servitude in His Majesty's Prison North America, which was extremely dangerous and volatile. The homicide rate was 20 times higher in the North American colonies than it is in today's United States of America. And this was before the breech-loading firearm was invented. This is not to say that homicide rates are low today in the USA. Every year, Yanks shoot each other dead at over 11,000 a year compared to 39 gun homicides in the UK during 2011. After the American colonies closed in 1776, British victims of the voting 3%'s laws were kept imprisoned in ships at harbor for over 2 years until the Crown's Prison Tasmania and later Prison Australia were opened. The insanity suffered from those suffrageless British incarcerated in prison ships saw the incarcerated erupt from their confinement to murder every indigenous Tasmanian without legal repercussions. Their madness was unleashed again upon Australia's original peoples, yet there was no escape from the insanity, the PTSD, and the effects of resulting dysfunction passed down through generations on both sides. Another problem is how to determine who is eligible for reparations. There are no beneficiaries of the Tasmanians to even collect reparations. Is someone with 2% Yoruba and 98% Western European entitled to the same total per person reparation as someone who is 100% Yoruba? What about Africans in the UK that are not descendants of slaves? The only just system of compensation as reparations is one that does not force those who had no vote, no say, nothing to do with the laws that created slavery, having to pay damages. Rather, the 3% who selected members of parliament and approved reparations to slave owners for giving up slaves, and their beneficiaries should be the ones to dip into their pockets to fund these yet to be decided reparations. Forcing descendants of non-African victims of the 3% to fund the African victims of the 3% seems unjust. This, in a nutshell, is the case against British people owing reparations as it is currently conceived. The reformist zeal to address the cultural and structural legacies of racism within Britain's technocultures and society is commendable. But to blame the working class also suffering without the right to vote during chattel slavery seems morally unfathomable. Some of these individuals played heroic roles in wresting political and legislative power from the voting 3%. Targeting their descendants to fund reparations rather than or in addition to the beneficiaries of the 3% seems wrong. In conclusion, I ask, are reparations from the beneficiaries of the voting 3% even possible?